It's 2 in the morning, and the blue and red lights just lit up your rearview mirror. Your heart does that thing where it forgets to beat for a second, and then it makes up for it by hammering against your ribs. You pull over, you turn off the car, you put your hands on the steering wheel where they tell you to. You're polite, you're respectful, you hand over your license and registration. And then instead of just writing the ticket or giving you a warning, the officer leans down, looks you in the eye, and starts arguing with you. He tells you that you're wrong, that you ran that stop sign even though you know for a fact you stopped. He tells you that your explanation doesn't make sense. He questions your story, your tone, your attitude, your very existence on that road at that hour. And suddenly, you're not just in a traffic stop, you're in a verbal combat zone with someone who has a gun, a badge, and the absolute authority to make your night a living hell. Here is the question I have for you, and I really want you to think about it because your answer might surprise you. When that officer starts arguing with you, pushing back against everything you say, questioning your honesty, do you stand your ground and defend the truth, or do you shut your mouth and let him have the last word, even if it means swallowing your pride? I'm serious. I want you to really picture that moment. Think about what your gut instinct would tell you to do. And then drop that answer in the comments. Tell me if you're the type to fight for your side of the story right there on the shoulder of the road, or if you're the type to go silent and let the chips fall where they may. The reason I'm asking is because the answer to that question, the one you just gave yourself, might be the very thing that determines whether you drive home tonight or end up in the back of a squad car with a set of bracelets on. Stick with me, because we're going to break down exactly what is happening in that officer's mind when he argues with you, why he's doing it, and how the wrong word at the wrong time can turn a $60 ticket into a felony charge. You have to understand something right off the bat that most people never really consider. When a police officer stops your car, he is not usually thinking about the law the way you think about it. You're thinking about facts. You're thinking about whether you came to a complete roll at that stop sign. You're thinking about the fact that you were only going 5 miles over the limit. You're thinking about logic and reason and the truth. He's thinking about control. He's thinking about safety. He's thinking about the hundreds of stops he's made before where people lied to him, where people got aggressive, where people tried to talk their way out of something that wasn't even a big deal. The argument he starts with you, that's rarely about the traffic infraction. That's a test. That is a probe. He is poking you to see what kind of person he's dealing with. And here is where most travelers, most everyday drivers make their first and biggest mistake. They think the argument is about the ticket. They think if they can just explain it clearly enough, just present their case persuasively enough, the officer will see the light, nod his head, and send them on their way with a smile. Let me tell you something that might sting a little. In that moment, the officer does not care about your explanation. He has heard every explanation in the book. He has heard the, "I was just keeping up with traffic" defense. He has heard the, "I didn't see the sign because it was covered by a branch" excuse. He has heard the, "I'm a nurse and I just got off a 16-hour shift and I'm exhausted and I need to get home to my kids" plea. He's heard them all. And after a while, explanations just sound like noise. They sound like resistance. When you start explaining, when you start trying to reason with him, you are not educating him. You are, in his mind, challenging his authority. You are telling him that his perception of events is wrong and that yours is right, and that right there is the spark that can light a fire. I remember a case I worked on a few years back, a guy who was driving from Florida to visit his sister in Virginia. He got pulled over for a burned-out taillight. Simple stop, routine. The officer told him about the light, and the guy, a perfectly nice, reasonable human being, said, "Oh, I didn't know. I just had the car serviced last week. They must have missed it." Innocent enough, right? But the officer, instead of just giving a warning, said, "Well, you should have checked it yourself. It's your responsibility." And the driver, feeling a little defensive, said, "I know, I'm just saying I didn't know. I would have fixed it if I did." The officer then said, "Are you telling me I'm wrong for stopping you?" And just like that, the tone shifted. The driver was now in an argument he didn't start and couldn't win. He wasn't arguing about the light anymore. He was arguing about the officer's right to do his job. That stop, which should have taken 4 minutes, turned into a 30-minute ordeal, a search of the vehicle, and ultimately a citation for a burned-out taillight and a secondary citation for a seatbelt violation they found during the stop. All because the driver felt the need to clarify his position in the face of an officer who was clearly looking for a reason to push back. Now you might be sitting there thinking, well, that's ridiculous. The officer was wrong to act that way. And maybe he was. But here's the hard truth that every experienced traveler learns at some point. Being right doesn't mean you're safe. Being right doesn't mean you're going home. On the side of the road, in the middle of the night, with the traffic whizzing by, the only thing that matters is the trajectory of that interaction. And the moment you engage in an argument, you are changing the trajectory. You are taking a flat, calm road and pointing it downhill. So what do you actually do when the officer starts arguing? The first thing, the absolute hardest thing for most people to do, is to let him win. I'm not talking about admitting to a crime you didn't commit. I'm talking about disengaging from the debate. If he says, "You ran that stop sign and you know you didn't," the worst thing you can say is, "No, I didn't." Because that no is a direct contradiction. It's a red flag to a bull. A much better approach, and one that takes practice, is to say nothing that concedes guilt, but nothing that argues the point. You can simply say, "I understand, officer," or you can stay silent. You don't have to agree with his version of events to comply with the stop. You can hand over your documents, you can answer basic identifying questions, and you can keep your mouth shut about the facts of the incident. Let him argue with himself. Let him tell you his version. You are not required to co-sign it. This is where the criminal defense lawyer part of my brain kicks in and starts screaming warnings at people. Because what you don't realize is that when you argue, you are giving him evidence. You are putting words in his mouth that he can later write in a report. If you say, "I didn't run that stop sign," and he writes in his report, "The driver became argumentative and defensive, claiming he didn't run the stop sign, but based on my training and experience, I observed the vehicle fail to stop." Now what do you have? You have his word against yours, but his word is in an official police report, and yours is just a memory. And if that stop escalates, if he finds something in your car or decides to arrest you for something else, that argument you had becomes part of the narrative. It becomes combative behavior. It becomes failure to comply. It becomes justification for a search. And let's talk about searches for a second, because this is where travelers especially get themselves into trouble. You're on a road trip. You've got luggage in the trunk. Maybe you've got a cooler with drinks. Maybe you've got a bag with a legal bottle of wine you bought at a vineyard. Maybe you've got absolutely nothing illegal whatsoever. But the officer, because he's annoyed that you argued with him, says, "You mind if I take a look in the car?" Now, most people, wanting to show they have nothing to hide, wanting to prove the officer wrong, wanting to demonstrate that they're a good person, say, "Sure, go ahead." And they just waived their Fourth Amendment rights. They just consented to a search that the officer may not have had legal grounds to perform. And if he finds something, and remember, cops are trained to find things, they can find a reason to cite you for a cracked windshield or an open container if they look hard enough. You have just handed him that victory on a silver platter. The argument on the side of the road is almost never about the traffic stop itself. It's about the dynamic. It's about power. It's about who is in control. And the answer to that question, legally and practically, is always the officer. He has the gun. He has the handcuffs. He has the radio to call for backup. You have a seatbelt and a cup holder. You cannot win a physical or verbal confrontation with him in that moment. The only way to win is to not play. The only way to win is to survive the interaction with your freedom intact and your rights preserved for a later date, like in a courtroom, where you have a judge and a lawyer and rules of evidence. I had a client once, a young woman driving from New York to Ohio to see her family for Thanksgiving. She got pulled over for speeding. The officer was aggressive from the start, accused her of going 15 over when she was really going maybe 8 over. She argued. She told him his radar must be wrong. She told him she'd been driving for years and never got a ticket. She told him she knew her speed. He argued back. It got heated. He asked her to step out of the car. She hesitated because she was scared. He took that hesitation as resistance. He physically pulled her out. He searched her car. He found nothing. But he found nothing after she had already been handcuffed, after she had already been terrified, after her Thanksgiving trip was ruined, all because she couldn't let him have the last word about the speed. She spent the night in a holding cell while they sorted things out, just for an attitude adjustment. She was released, no charges, but the trauma of that night, the memory of being treated like a criminal because she argued with a cop about a speeding ticket, that stays with you. Now, I'm not saying you have to be a doormat. I'm not saying you have to grovel. I'm saying you have to be smart. You have to understand the psychology of the person standing at your window. That officer, especially late at night, especially on a lonely highway, is in a state of high alert. His brain is scanning for threats. An argumentative driver is, in his threat assessment, a potential problem. He doesn't know if you're arguing because you're innocent, or because you're drunk, or because you have a warrant, or because you have a body in the trunk. To him, argument equals risk, and he is trained to mitigate risk by any means necessary. That might mean asking you more questions. It might mean asking you to step out. It might mean calling for a K-9 unit. It might mean searching your car. You are giving him the permission slip to do all of those things when you engage in that argument. There's a reason why the standard advice from almost every criminal defense attorney in the country is to be polite, be quiet, and say no to searches. It sounds simple, but it's incredibly hard to do when your ego is bruised, when you feel wronged, when you feel the hot sting of injustice. We are wired to defend ourselves. We are wired to explain. We are wired to set the record straight. And on a normal day, in a normal conversation, that's healthy. But a traffic stop is not a normal conversation. It is a legal encounter with potentially severe consequences. You have to override your wiring. You have to recognize that the officer's argument is a trap, a test, a fishing expedition. He wants to see if you'll bite. He wants to see if you'll give him a reason to dig deeper. Think about the language he uses. He might say, "So you're telling me you didn't see that sign?" That's not a question seeking information. That's a question designed to get you to admit you were distracted. If you say, "No, I didn't see it," he can write in his report that you admitted to inattentive driving. If you say, "I saw it and I stopped," he can write that you were confrontational. You see the bind? You're in a lose-lose situation if you try to play his game. The only way out is to refuse to play. You can say, "I'd rather not answer any questions about the stop, officer. I'm happy to wait here while you do what you need to do." That's your right. That is the invocation of your Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. And yes, it might make him pause. It might make him look at you differently, but it is a clear, legal, and protected way to disengage from the argument without being disrespectful. Travelers, especially those crossing state lines, have an additional layer of complexity to worry about. You might be in a jurisdiction where the laws are different. You might be in a state where implied consent laws mean something else. You might be on a federal highway where different rules apply. The officer knows this. He knows you're not from around there. He knows you're tired, you're disoriented. You just want to get to your hotel or your relative's house. And he might use that vulnerability to push you harder. He might say things like, "Look, if you just cooperate, I'll let you off with a warning." That's a classic line. It's a carrot dangled in front of you to get you to admit something, or to consent to a search. And 9 times out of 10, that warning never materializes. Once you consent, once you admit, the leverage is gone, and the ticket comes out anyway. I've seen it happen more times than I can count. The officer argues with you, gets you flustered, then offers an olive branch. "Just tell me the truth, and we can forget this whole thing." And the driver, desperate to escape the situation, says, "Okay, fine. I probably wasn't paying attention for a second." And just like that, the officer has his admission. He writes the ticket for reckless driving, which is a much more serious offense than a simple speeding ticket. The driver thought he was buying his freedom, but he was actually signing his own conviction. That's the danger of engaging. That's the danger of letting the argument pull you in. So what does a successful traffic stop look like? It looks boring. It looks like a driver with his hands on the wheel, his license and registration ready, who answers basic questions politely but doesn't offer any extra information. When the officer says, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the smart driver doesn't say, "Yeah, I was speeding." The smart driver says, "I'm not sure, officer." That's not an argument. That's not a challenge. It's a neutral statement that doesn't admit guilt and doesn't start a debate. It puts the burden on the officer to state his case. Then when he tells you why, you don't argue. You don't explain. You just say, "Okay," or you say nothing at all. You accept the citation if he gives you one. You sign it, which is not an admission of guilt, only a promise to appear or pay. And then you go on your way. If you want to fight the ticket, you fight it in court, where the rules are fair, where you have representation, where the playing field is level. But on the side of the road, you have no rights that matter if you aren't willing to exercise them intelligently. The right to remain silent is useless if you feel compelled to fill every silence with an explanation. The right to refuse a search is useless if you cave the second the officer applies pressure. The right to an attorney is useless if you talk yourself into handcuffs before you ever get to a phone. Let me give you a little insight into how the system works behind the scenes, the stuff most people never see. When an officer writes a report, he is crafting a narrative. He is telling a story that justifies his actions. If you argued with him, that story includes phrases like, "The driver became irate," "The driver was uncooperative," "The driver refused to answer simple questions," or "The driver's behavior was consistent with someone under the influence." Those phrases carry weight. They get read by prosecutors. They influence charging decisions. If it's a simple traffic infraction, maybe it doesn't matter. But if there's any ambiguity, if there's any possibility of a more serious charge, your argumentative behavior becomes the tiebreaker. It becomes the reason they file the charge. It becomes the reason they push for a higher bond. I had another client, a businessman driving from Chicago to Detroit for a meeting. He got pulled over for weaving in his lane. He wasn't drunk. He was just tired and checking his phone for directions. The officer asked him if he'd been drinking. He said no. The officer didn't believe him. They started arguing. The officer asked him to do field sobriety tests. He refused, which was his right, but he refused belligerently. He said things like, "This is harassment," and "You're wasting my time." The officer arrested him for suspicion of DUI. He spent the night in jail. He lost his business meeting. He had to hire me to defend him. And you know what the blood test showed? Zero. Absolutely zero alcohol. He was completely sober, but he still got arrested. He still spent the night in jail. He still had to pay me thousands of dollars. Why? Because he couldn't just politely refuse the tests. He had to argue. He had to let the officer know how wrong he was. And that argument gave the officer the probable cause he needed to make the arrest. The officer wrote in his report that the driver was argumentative, with bloodshot eyes and slurred speech. The slurred speech was just exhaustion. The bloodshot eyes were from staring at a screen for 4 hours. But in the report, it looked like a DUI. This is the reality of the situation. This is what's at stake when you open your mouth to argue. You might be right. You might be completely, totally, unequivocally right. But being right doesn't stop a set of handcuffs from clicking shut. Being right doesn't pay your legal fees. Being right doesn't undo the damage to your reputation or your record. The only thing that does that is keeping your mouth shut and letting the process play out in a place where you have actual power. Now, I want to touch on something that's going to make some of you uncomfortable. There is a segment of the population for whom this advice is not just helpful, it's survival. I'm talking about anyone who belongs to a demographic that is statistically more likely to be viewed with suspicion by law enforcement. If you are a person of color, if you are driving a vehicle that doesn't match the neighborhood you're in, if you have out-of-state plates in an area that doesn't see many tourists, the stakes are even higher. The officer's argument might start before you even say a word. He might be looking for a reason to escalate. And in that context, arguing is not just foolish, it's potentially dangerous. You have to be hypervigilant about your behavior. You have to be a model of calm, respectful, non-confrontational compliance. Not because you're admitting guilt, but because you want to go home. You want to live to fight another day. That's not cowardice, that's strategy. That's recognizing the reality of the situation and making the best choice for your own safety. I've talked to so many people over the years who tell me, "But I have rights. The Constitution is on my side." And they're right. It is. But the Constitution is not a force field. It's a legal document. It protects you in a courtroom, not necessarily on a dark road at midnight. To access those rights, you have to survive the encounter. You have to get to that courtroom. And the best way to do that is to avoid giving the officer any excuse to take you there against your will. There's a moment in almost every traffic stop that escalates where the driver realizes they've gone too far. It's that split second when the officer's hand moves to his belt, or his tone changes from conversational to commanding, or he steps back and puts his hand on his weapon. In that moment, the driver's heart sinks. They know they messed up. They know they should have just kept quiet. But by then, it's too late. The train has left the station. The argument has become an incident, and you can't unring that bell. So, what do you do if you find yourself in the middle of an argument before you even realized it started? How do you de-escalate? The first thing you do is stop talking. Mid-sentence. Just stop. Let the silence hang there. It will feel awkward. It will feel like you're giving up. But it's the most powerful tool you have. When you stop talking, you remove the fuel from the fire. The officer can't argue with a silent person for very long. He might try to provoke you. He might ask, "What? You're not going to say anything now?" You don't take the bait. You just look ahead, keep your hands visible, and wait. If you need to say something, you say, "I'm not going to argue with you, officer. I'm just going to sit here quietly." That's it. That's your exit ramp. I want to plant a seed in your mind that I hope stays with you every time you get behind the wheel. The traffic stop is not a conversation. It is not a debate. It is not a therapy session. It is a law enforcement action. Your goal is not to be understood. Your goal is not to be liked. Your goal is not to convince the officer of anything. Your goal is to terminate the encounter as quickly and safely as possible, with as little information given as possible, and with your freedom intact. That's it. That's the only goal. Everything else is a distraction. And speaking of distractions, have you ever noticed how often people get pulled over when they're already having a bad day? You're late for something. You're stressed about work. You just had an argument with your spouse, you're tired, you're hungry, you're in a bad mood, and then those lights come on. And your bad mood turns into frustration, and your frustration turns into anger, and your anger turns into an argument. The officer doesn't know you are having a bad day. He just knows you're angry at him, and he takes it personally. You have to separate your mood from the moment. You have to compartmentalize. You have to put on a mask of calm, even if inside you're boiling, because the second you let that boiling over, you're done. I remember a case where a woman was pulled over on her way to the hospital. Her mother had been in an accident. She was distraught, crying, speeding to get there. The officer stopped her. She tried to explain through her tears. He wasn't having it. He told her to calm down. She got more upset. He told her to step out of the car. She refused, saying she needed to get to the hospital. He physically removed her. She ended up arrested for resisting. Her mother died while she was sitting in a holding cell. Now that's an extreme and tragic case, but it illustrates the point. The officer didn't care about her reason. He cared about her compliance. And her refusal to comply, born out of desperation, led to a catastrophe. Could she have handled it differently? Could she have said, "Officer, my mother is in the hospital. I'm very upset. I'm going to pull over here and I'm going to sit quietly, but please, can you hurry?" Maybe, maybe not. But arguing, resisting, refusing, that guaranteed the worst outcome. We have to think about these scenarios before they happen. We have to rehearse them in our minds. We have to have a plan, because when the adrenaline hits, when the fear kicks in, when the injustice of it all makes your blood boil, you will default to your instincts. And if your instinct is to argue, to defend, to explain, you are going to lose. But if your instinct is to go quiet, to go still, to protect yourself by saying nothing, you have a chance. You have to reprogram that instinct. Let's talk about the aftermath for a second, because the stop ends, but the consequences can linger. You get the ticket, you go home, you're fuming. You're telling your friends, your family, anyone who will listen about the injustice, about how the cop was wrong, about how you argued your point. And they're nodding, saying, "Yeah, that's terrible." But here's what they're not telling you. They're not telling you that you played right into his hands. They're not telling you that every word you said on that roadside is now part of a record that can be used against you. They're not telling you that your argumentative behavior is now documented. And if you try to fight the ticket in court, the officer will show up with his report, and the judge will read about how you were combative, and that will color everything. I've sat in courtrooms and watched it happen. A driver gets up to contest a ticket. They're polite, they're well-spoken, they make a good argument. Then the officer takes the stand. He says, "Your Honor, the driver was very argumentative at the scene. He refused to listen. He insisted he was right." And you can see the judge's demeanor change. Suddenly, the driver isn't just someone who might have made a mistake. He's someone who doesn't respect authority, and that's a hard bias to overcome. The driver is no longer fighting the ticket. He's fighting his own behavior, and he's losing. So, what's the takeaway here? What's the one thing you should remember above all else? It's this. The traffic stop is a test of your self-control. It is a test of your ability to swallow your pride and prioritize your freedom over your ego. The officer may argue, he may provoke, he may insult, he may be completely and utterly wrong. None of that matters in that moment. What matters is that you get through it. You let him have his say. You let him write his ticket. You let him drive away. And then, when you're safe, when you're home, when you're calm, you decide what to do next. You want to file a complaint? You can do that. You want to fight the ticket? You can do that. You want to tell your story to the world? You can do that. But you do it from a position of strength, not from a jail cell or a courtroom where you're already at a disadvantage. I've been doing this for a long time. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of law enforcement. I've seen officers who are saints and officers who are bullies. I've seen drivers who are victims and drivers who are criminals. And through it all, one thing remains constant. The people who come out on top, the people who walk away with their records clean and their sanity intact, are the people who know when to shut up. They're the ones who understand that silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. Silence is power. Think about the most powerful people you know, the ones who are truly in control. Do they argue with every person who challenges them? Do they feel the need to correct every misconception? No. They let things slide. They pick their battles. They know that engaging in a petty argument with someone who has the upper hand in that moment is a waste of energy and a source of vulnerability. You have to be that person on the side of the road. You have to be the person who is so secure in their own knowledge of the truth that they don't need to prove it to a stranger with a badge. And here's a little secret that might help you the next time you feel that argument rising in your throat. The officer doesn't actually know if you're guilty or not. He has his perception, he has his radar reading, he has his opinion, but he doesn't know your intent. He doesn't know your state of mind. He doesn't know the circumstances that led to that moment. All he knows is what he saw, and his version of events is just that, a version. When you argue with him, you are trying to replace his version with yours. And that's a battle you cannot win because he is the official record keeper. He writes the first draft of history. Your version, no matter how eloquent, no matter how true, is just a footnote until you get to court. So save it. Save it for the judge. Save it for the lawyer. Save it for the one place where it might actually make a difference. I want to circle back to that question I asked you at the very beginning, the one about whether you stand your ground or shut your mouth. I hope by now you're starting to see that standing your ground doesn't mean arguing. Standing your ground means holding on to your rights without announcing them. It means refusing to incriminate yourself without being belligerent. It means exiting the encounter with your dignity intact, not because you won the argument, but because you refuse to participate in it. That is true strength. That is true control. The next time you're driving and you see those lights in your mirror, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to take a deep breath. I want you to put your hands on the wheel. And I want you to make a silent pledge to yourself that no matter what that officer says, no matter how much he tries to provoke you, no matter how wrong he is, you will not argue. You will be polite, you will be quiet, and you will go home. Because at the end of the day, that's all that matters, getting home. Now, I've thrown a lot at you. I've given you the psychology, the legal reality, the horror stories, and the success strategies. But I want to hear from you. I want to know what you think. Have you ever been in a situation where you argued with an officer? How did it turn out? Do you think you could keep your mouth shut if you felt you were being treated unfairly? Or do you think your sense of justice would force you to speak up? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me your stories. Tell me your fears. Tell me your questions. Because this isn't just a lecture, it's a conversation, and your experiences are just as important as anything I can tell you. We're all in this together, navigating a world where a simple drive can turn into a life-changing event. The more we share, the more we learn, the better prepared we are. So don't be shy. Hit that comment button and let me know. I'll be reading them. I always do. And who knows, maybe your story will be the one that helps someone else avoid the same mistake. Drive safe. Stay smart, and remember, the strongest thing you can say on a traffic stop is often nothing at all.